One of them became one of the most recognizable faces on television, only to spend years battling scandal, heartbreak, and public humiliation behind the scenes. Another quietly disappeared from Hollywood after fame faded and life became far more difficult than audiences ever imagined. One cast member struggled with addiction, failed relationships, and emotional collapse, while millions still remembered them running in slow motion beneath the California sun. And behind the beauty, beaches, and fantasy that made Baywatch a global phenomenon, there were real lives slowly unraveling in private. For an entire generation, Baywatch looked perfect. Perfect bodies, perfect sunsets, perfect lives. The show became more than television, it became a symbol of the 1990s itself. Millions of viewers around the world watched lifeguards race across the sand while dramatic music played beneath endless California skies. But real life behind the cameras was far less glamorous. Because fame built on beauty creates a brutal kind of pressure, especially in Hollywood. The audience expects you to remain young forever, attractive forever, relevant forever. And when time inevitably changes everything, many stars are left emotionally lost inside an image they can no longer maintain. Some members of the Baywatch cast became trapped by the fame that once made them untouchable. Others watched their careers collapse after the spotlight moved on. There were divorces, financial problems, addiction, public scandals, private loneliness hidden behind magazine covers, and red carpet smiles. And for several cast members, aging in Hollywood became emotionally devastating. Because while audiences still remember Baywatch as sunshine and fantasy, many of the people inside that fantasy were quietly fighting battles nobody could see. And by the end of this story, the world of Baywatch may no longer feel glamorous at all. When Baywatch exploded onto television screens in the late 1980s and early 1990s, it became something much bigger than a TV show. It became a global obsession. The red swimsuits, the slow-motion running, the California beaches glowing beneath golden sunlight. Everything about Baywatch felt larger than life. At its peak, the series reached audiences in more than 140 countries and became one of the most watched television shows in history. Millions of people who had never even visited California suddenly imagined it as paradise because of Baywatch. The show sold a fantasy the world desperately wanted to believe in. Freedom, youth, beauty, endless summer. And at the center of that fantasy stood some of the most recognizable faces of the entire decade. David Hasselhoff became television royalty almost overnight. Pamela Anderson transformed into an international icon. Yasmine Bleeth represented the mysterious beauty audiences could not stop staring at. And together, the cast helped create one of the most unforgettable visual identities in television history. But underneath all the glamour, Baywatch was also deeply tied to something emotional for many viewers: memory. For millions of Americans, the show now feels connected to another version of life entirely. A simpler time, before social media, before streaming, before Hollywood became darker and more cynical. People remember hearing the theme song late at night after school, watching beach sunsets while lifeguards sprinted across the sand. The excitement, the fantasy, the feeling that everyone on screen looked impossibly confident and untouchable. But perhaps that illusion became dangerous for the cast themselves, because Baywatch was built almost entirely around appearance, around youth, around the idea that beauty could stop time itself. And Hollywood has always been especially cruel to stars whose fame depends on looking perfect. As the years passed, several cast members quietly discovered something heartbreaking. The same world that once worshipped them for their beauty would eventually punish them for growing older. Some struggled emotionally after the fame faded. Others battled addiction, scandal, failed marriages, or career collapse. And behind the smiles, audiences remember so vividly, many members of the Baywatch cast were already carrying insecurities and pain the public never fully saw, especially one star who became the face of the entire series. Because while millions viewed Baywatch as fantasy, for Pamela Anderson, fame itself slowly became a prison. For millions of people around the world, Pamela Anderson was Baywatch. The moment she appeared running across the beach in a red swimsuit, television history changed forever. Her image became one of the most recognizable symbols of the 1990s, not just in America, but globally. She was everywhere: magazine covers, posters, talk shows, tabloids. Hollywood transformed Pamela Anderson into a fantasy almost overnight, and at first it looked like the dream life every young actress wanted. Fame, beauty, money, attention. But behind the image that millions obsessed over, Pamela's real life was becoming increasingly painful and emotionally chaotic. Because Baywatch did not simply make her famous, it turned her into an object the entire world believed they owned. And that kind of fame slowly destroys privacy, identity, and emotional safety. Long before Baywatch, Pamela had already experienced trauma and instability in her personal life. But once global fame arrived, everything intensified. Hollywood no longer saw her as a normal human being. The industry saw an image, a brand, a fantasy to sell endlessly. And over time, Pamela herself began disappearing beneath that fantasy. The pressure became relentless. Every interview focused on her appearance. Every headline reduced her to sex appeal. Very few people cared about who she actually was beneath the image. And perhaps that emotional loneliness became even worse after her explosive relationship with Tommy Lee turned into one of the most publicized celebrity marriages in modern history. At first, audiences were fascinated by them. The wild romance, the danger, the chaos. They looked like the ultimate celebrity couple of the 1990s. But behind the cameras, the relationship slowly became emotionally destructive. Arguments, jealousy, public scandal, and eventually, the infamous private tape scandal that changed Pamela Anderson's life forever. Suddenly, one of the most famous women in the world was no longer controlling her own image at all. The humiliation became global. And perhaps what made the situation especially tragic was how little compassion Hollywood showed her afterward. The world consumed the scandal as entertainment, while Pamela herself was emotionally drowning inside it. Years later, audiences finally began understanding something painful. Pamela Anderson was not benefiting from the fantasy. She was trapped inside it. As Baywatch faded and Hollywood moved toward newer stars, Pamela faced another brutal reality many actresses eventually confront. The industry that once worshipped her beauty was now punishing her for aging. Roles became smaller, public attention shifted, relationships collapsed, and behind the glamorous image people still remembered, there were years filled with emotional exhaustion, failed marriages, financial struggles, and the painful search for identity beyond fame. Yet somehow, what makes Pamela Anderson's story so emotional today is that she survived long enough to reclaim her humanity publicly. As she grew older, she slowly stepped away from the artificial Hollywood image that once consumed her. She appeared without heavy makeup, spoke openly about emotional pain, exploitation, and loneliness. And for the first time, many people began seeing her not as a fantasy, but as a deeply wounded human being. And strangely, audiences respected her more than ever because of it. Because beneath all the fame and scandal, Pamela Anderson represented something heartbreaking about Hollywood itself. The world loves beautiful women most when they remain silent fantasies. But the moment they grow older, vulnerable, or human, the industry often abandons them completely. Still, as tragic as Pamela Anderson's story became, another Baywatch star was quietly spiraling toward a much darker emotional collapse behind the scenes, and her downfall would shock millions of fans who once believed the Baywatch cast lived perfect lives forever. At the height of Baywatch, Yasmine Bleeth looked untouchable. With her striking beauty, mysterious presence, and natural charisma, she quickly became one of the most popular stars on the series. Audiences were captivated by her. Magazine covers called her one of the most beautiful women in the world. Hollywood treated her like the future. For a moment, it seemed like she had everything: fame, attention, success. But behind the scenes, Yasmine Bleeth was quietly falling apart. And perhaps that is what made her story so heartbreaking. Because Baywatch sold the illusion of perfect lives while several cast members were privately battling emotional pain nobody could see. As Yasmine's fame exploded during the 1990s, the pressure surrounding her appearance and public image became relentless. Hollywood constantly demanded perfection. Every interview focused on beauty. Every photo shoot pushed the fantasy further. And over time, maintaining that fantasy became emotionally exhausting. Like many celebrities suddenly thrown into global fame, Yasmine struggled with insecurity and emotional instability beneath the glamorous surface. The public saw confidence, but internally things were becoming darker. Then came addiction. Cocaine slowly entered her life during a period when Hollywood excess surrounded nearly every corner of celebrity culture. At first, the signs were subtle, but over time, the addiction became impossible to hide. Suddenly, the woman audiences remembered running through sunlight on Baywatch began appearing in tabloids for entirely different reasons. Erratic behavior, legal trouble, emotional collapse, and eventually one of the most shocking falls from grace of the entire Baywatch era. In 2001, Yasmine Bleeth was arrested after a drug-related incident involving cocaine and dangerous driving. The story exploded across media outlets instantly. For audiences who still viewed Baywatch as glamorous fantasy, the reality felt disturbing. Because behind the beauty and fame was someone deeply struggling to survive emotionally. And perhaps the saddest part was how quickly Hollywood abandoned her afterward. The same industry that once celebrated her beauty moved on almost immediately once addiction and scandal entered the picture. Roles disappeared, public support faded, the spotlight turned cruel, and suddenly, one of television's biggest stars became another cautionary tale. For years afterward, Yasmine largely disappeared from Hollywood entirely. No major comeback, no glamorous reinvention, just silence. And that silence became deeply emotional for longtime fans, because audiences remembered how huge she once was during Baywatch's peak years. She represented youth, fantasy, desire. Then suddenly, she was gone. But unlike many celebrity stories destroyed completely by addiction, Yasmine eventually found something Hollywood rarely allows struggling stars to have: privacy, distance from the machine that nearly consumed her. She stepped away from fame almost entirely and focused on rebuilding her life quietly away from cameras and tabloids. And perhaps that disappearance itself says something painful about celebrity culture. Sometimes survival means walking away from the spotlight forever. Because not every actor survives fame emotionally intact. Some simply escape it the best they can. And maybe that is why Yasmine Bleeth's story feels so haunting today. She became one of the defining faces of an era, only to vanish almost completely from the world that once worshipped her. But while Yasmine's downfall became one of Baywatch's most shocking tragedies, the emotional story waiting ahead would become even sadder. Because one member of the cast would eventually discover that fame built on image and popularity can disappear overnight, leaving behind loneliness, heartbreak, and the terrifying fear of being forgotten. For an entire generation, David Hasselhoff did not just star in Baywatch. He was Baywatch. Standing on the beach beneath the California sun with confidence and authority, Hasselhoff became one of the most recognizable television stars in the world. At the peak of the show's success, his face was everywhere. Millions of people saw him as the symbol of strength, fame, and endless charisma. He looked unstoppable, and perhaps that is exactly why his downfall felt so shocking. Long before Baywatch became a worldwide phenomenon, Hasselhoff had already experienced television fame through Knight Rider, but Baywatch elevated him into something much larger than a normal celebrity. He became a global brand, a fantasy, a symbol of the 1990s itself, and for a while he embraced it completely. The fame, the attention, the larger-than-life image. But maintaining that image for years slowly became emotionally exhausting, because underneath the confidence audiences saw on screen, David Hasselhoff was carrying insecurities and emotional struggles that fame could never erase. As the years passed, his personal life became increasingly chaotic. Marriages fractured under pressure, public scrutiny intensified, tabloids followed every mistake relentlessly, and behind the scenes, alcohol slowly became a growing problem. At first, many fans refused to believe it. David Hasselhoff looked too powerful, too successful, too iconic. But addiction does not care about fame, and eventually the cracks became impossible to hide. Then came the moment that changed his public image forever. A deeply disturbing video surfaced showing Hasselhoff intoxicated and emotionally collapsing, while his daughter desperately pleaded with him to stop drinking. The footage spread across the internet instantly, For millions of viewers, it was horrifying to watch, not because they suddenly hated him, but because the man they remembered as larger than life suddenly looked painfully human, broken, embarrassed, vulnerable. And perhaps that vulnerability became the saddest part of all. Because David Hasselhoff represented an era of television built on confidence, glamour, and fantasy, seeing him emotionally unravel in public felt like watching the illusion itself collapse. The internet mocked him endlessly afterward. Late-night comedians turned his pain into jokes. Memes replaced empathy. And beneath all the humiliation was a man clearly struggling emotionally while the world consumed his lowest moments as entertainment. Yet somehow, Hasselhoff survived it. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but honestly enough that audiences eventually began viewing him differently with age. Less as a caricature, more as a human being damaged by decades of fame, pressure, and emotional instability. As he grew older, something strange happened to David Hasselhoff's legacy. The arrogance people once mocked slowly transformed into sadness and nostalgia. Fans began remembering not the scandals first, but the memories. Knight Rider, Baywatch, the music, the beaches, the feeling of another time in life when everything still seemed exciting and uncomplicated. And perhaps that emotional shift happens because audiences themselves grow older too. They begin understanding that celebrities are often far lonelier than they appear, especially those whose entire identity becomes built around remaining young, desirable, and famous forever. Because eventually, Hollywood moves on. The spotlight fades, and the people once worshipped by millions are left alone trying to figure out who they are without the image that defined them. Still, as painful as David Hasselhoff's story became, the emotional legacy of Baywatch itself would grow even more bittersweet with time. Because behind all the beauty, fantasy, and sunshine, the cast was quietly learning the same lesson so many Hollywood stars eventually face. Nothing glamorous lasts forever. Perhaps the cruelest part of Baywatch was this. The show became famous for making its cast look perfect. But perfection is impossible to survive forever. For years, the world watched beautiful people run across beaches beneath golden sunlight while dramatic music played in the background. The cast looked untouchable, ageless, almost unreal. And maybe that fantasy damaged them more than audiences ever understood. Because once Hollywood turns your appearance into your identity, growing older can begin to feel terrifying, especially for women, especially in the entertainment industry. As the years passed after Baywatch reached its peak, several cast members quietly struggled with the emotional pressure of aging in public. The tabloids that once praised them now criticized every physical change mercilessly. Wrinkles became headlines. Weight changes became gossip. Aging itself became treated like failure. And perhaps that emotional cruelty affected Pamela Anderson more deeply than anyone. For decades, the world reduced her entire identity to beauty and sex appeal. Yet as she grew older, Pamela slowly began rejecting the artificial image Hollywood built around her. She stopped chasing impossible perfection, appeared publicly with little or no makeup, spoke honestly about loneliness, exploitation, and the emotional exhaustion of spending years being viewed more as fantasy than as a person. And strangely, audiences connected with her more than ever before, because for the first time they were seeing the real human being underneath the Baywatch image. Not the fantasy, not the poster, not the icon frozen in the 1990s. Just a woman trying to survive the emotional aftermath of being objectified by the entire world. That emotional honesty became rare in Hollywood, especially among stars whose fame depended almost entirely on appearance. And perhaps that is what makes revisiting Baywatch so strangely emotional now. The show once represented youth without limits. Now it reminds audiences how temporary youth really is. The beaches still look beautiful. The sunsets still glow. The slow-motion scenes still trigger nostalgia instantly. But the people inside those memories changed. Some disappeared from public life completely. Some battled addiction and emotional collapse. Some watched fame slowly fade away while trying to preserve pieces of the identity the audience once loved. And others simply grew older, while the world struggled accepting that they were no longer the same people from television, because nostalgia freezes celebrities in time. but real life never does. That emotional contradiction becomes almost painful watching Baywatch today, especially for viewers who grew older beside the cast themselves. The teenagers who once watched Baywatch after school are now middle-aged adults reflecting on how quickly life moved. And maybe that is the hidden sadness behind the legacy of the entire show. Baywatch sold the fantasy that beauty and youth could last forever, but time eventually came for everyone inside it. And as the years passed, the emotional meaning of the show quietly changed. It stopped being just fantasy. It became memory, a reminder of another era, another version of life, another version of ourselves. But before the story of Baywatch finally comes to an end, there is one final truth about the cast that makes the entire legacy even more heartbreaking. Many of them eventually discovered that the world only truly loved them when they looked untouchable. The moment they became human, Hollywood began looking away. Today, when people remember Baywatch, they usually remember the fantasy first. The beaches, the sunsets, the red swimsuits, beautiful people running in slow motion beneath perfect California skies. For a moment, the show made the world believe life could actually look like that forever. Youthful, exciting, intouchable. But time changed everything. And perhaps that is why Baywatch feels so much sadder revisiting it now than it did decades ago. Because audiences are no longer watching only the fantasy. They are watching what happened after the fantasy faded away. Pamela Anderson eventually revealed the emotional damage caused by years of objectification and public humiliation. Yasmine Bleeth disappeared almost entirely from Hollywood after addiction and personal collapse nearly destroyed her life. David Hasselhoff became a painful symbol of what happens when fame, loneliness, and addiction slowly consume someone the world once treated like invincible royalty. And behind all the beauty and glamour, the cast themselves quietly discovered something devastating. Hollywood only celebrates perfection temporarily. The moment age appears, the moment vulnerability appears, the moment the fantasy becomes human, the industry often moves on without mercy. That realization became emotionally brutal for many members of the Baywatch cast because the show itself was built entirely around image, around youth, around looking desirable forever. But nobody remains frozen in sunlight forever. Bodies age, careers fade, relationships fail, fame disappears, and eventually, the people once worshipped by millions are left confronting ordinary human loneliness behind extraordinary public memories. Yet despite all the heartbreak surrounding the cast, Baywatch somehow still survives emotionally inside millions of people. Because for viewers, the series became attached to another time in life entirely. Late nights in the 1990s, summer memories, childhood bedrooms, the feeling that the future still looked exciting and endless. And maybe that is why the cast's real-life struggles feel so personal to audiences now. Because watching them grow older forces viewers to confront something painful about themselves too. Time passed for everyone. The teenagers who once watched Baywatch are no longer young. The fantasy of endless summers no longer feels real. And the stars who once looked immortal slowly became fragile human beings, carrying emotional scars the world never expected to see. But perhaps there is still something strangely beautiful about that. Because once the glamour fades away, what remains is honesty. Real people, real suffering, real survival. And maybe that humanity is what finally makes the legacy of Baywatch feel meaningful after all these years. Not the beauty, not the fame, not the fantasy, just the reminder that behind every perfect image Hollywood sells to the world, there is always a real person trying to survive underneath it. The cameras stopped rolling, the beaches grew quiet, and many of the stars changed forever. But somewhere, every time the Baywatch theme begins playing again, millions of people are instantly transported back to another version of themselves. A younger version, a hopeful version, a version that still believed summer would last forever.